Before I went to bed last night, I scrawled on a little piece of paper, and I've got it here that Google, you
Yeah.
can't see it because it's mirrored. It says Google knows us better than we know ourselves.
Mm.
And this is something that I'm not necessarily terrified of all of the time, but I am a little bit of the time. So can you explain how these, not necessarily Google, just these tech firms who have a lot of data on individuals, how that works, the models they create, and why we should be concerned about that?
Um, yeah, absolutely. So, we're not as unpredictable as we would like to think we are.
No.
We have very, very sort of individually repeatable patterns, and the and we're also quite like other people. And there was a fascinating survey done by uh, YouGov, which is a polling company in the UK. I think just after Brexit, and it was they just all they did was they correlated um, certain kind of consumer products with whether you're a lever or a remainer, right? And if you
Mm.
liked Branston's pickle and HP sauce, you were much more likely to be a lever. And if you liked, I think it was kind of Virgin Atlantic, right, as an airline, you were much more
Mm.
likely to be a Remainer. Um, and so we're not as predictable as we would like to think we are. We send out all sorts of different types of signals, and uh, what has happened over the last 30 or 40 years has been that we have digitized much more of our behaviors, and companies realized that having access to that digital data about behaviors in general would allow them to produce better and better products. And uh, you know, so when you look at a company like Google, they started with very very sort of naive, as we think of today, sense that you would crawl the web and you would look at the structure of the web and how pages point to each other in order to help us make sense of that. And they started to realize that their machine learning algorithms, which are bits of software that effectively learn from the patterns of the data that they see. This isn't magic. This is just about um, as simple as if I showed you six men, one of them is 5'1" and five or 6'8", and I said point to the one who's not going to be so good at basketball. It's quite easy for you to do that, right? It's the
Yeah.
5'1" person, and point to the one who's going to be a better jockey is
Yeah.
the same thing, right? And then, yeah, there might be confounding factors in all of that, of course,
Mm.
but in general, you'd be right there. And so these sort of correlations exist. And we what Google realized quite early on, there's a very famous scientific paper called the unreasonable effectiveness of data, was that you can get better and better predictions from more and more data, even if you use simple maths. So you didn't. So in order to build a kind of amazing system that could be help you search the web better, you're almost better with a kind of naive piece of maths and loads of data, and the more data the better,
Mm.
than you were with a really sophisticated algorithm and much less data. And the most modern AI systems, these sort of deep neural networks that have started to emerge in 2012, do even better with more and more data. And so there's a kind of fundamental sort of scientific reason why that excess of data is really really valuable if you sort of don't ask questions about like what are the social impacts of it. um and this notion that Google therefore knows us better than we might know ourselves is because what we do through our kind of web interactions and um is a revealed preference. So even if you say you never read the Daily Mail because you're above that,
Yeah.
and for those listeners who are not in the UK, the Daily Mail is a sort of tabloid newspaper which is very famous on the web for having this thing on the right called the sidebar of shame with all these salacious stories. So you might go at your hoity-toity dinner party and say, listen, I only read Baudrillard when I'm not reading Aristophanes. And I would never touch the Daily Mail. But Google or the web knows better. because they
Yeah.
know that you're looking at the sidebar of shame, in my case, 4 times a day. Um, and that's a revealed preference. And but the thing is that this all of this stuff can be tied together and can be connected. And a lot of it is delivered for us, for our benefit. And you may have noticed this, right? When you start to go on a plan for a holiday and you're starting to think, well, let me find interesting cafes near Lyon, um, the command completion within Google will start to put near Lyon as an option within a few queries. And that's really, really helpful. But that's only happening because of these kind of statistical correlations that it's running in the background. And because of the exponential age, those things used to 10 years ago take weeks to calculate, and now they take seconds to
Yeah.
calculate. And you get this much, much more nuanced approach. And you'll see it even with your GPS system now. You know, if you fire up Waze, and I fire up Waze and I'm at home, and it's a morning, the top 3 results are my kids' schools. Whereas if I'm at my mum's house, the top result is my home, because it's already figuring out where
Yeah.
I think I need to go. And of course, the problem with all of that is about um, the sense that we might be manipulated into doing things that are not in our own benefit. And you're starting to see some legislation um, that is connected to sort of privacy legislation that is about putting the constraints on that sort of behavior, and in particular, starting to say you can only use the data that you've gathered about a person for the purpose for which they asked you to gather the data. In other words, famously, about 7 or 8 years ago, a woman in America started to get coupons for baby products,
Mm.
and she didn't know she was pregnant, but her shopping patterns had sufficiently changed for people to figure out she was in her third trimester. First end of her first trimester, whatever whatever it happened to be.
Cool.
And so finding, this is where regulators can come in, and they can say, look, we're now going to protect you, and we're going to say we can only data can only be used for the reasons for which you gave it to be to be used. Now, there is obviously a cost to that, because in that example it was a pregnancy thing. But let's say you could, through my shopping patterns, determine that I'm at stage 1 bladder cancer,
Mm.
right? So I don't know if you could. I'm just making that up,
Mm.
right? But just imagine that based on whether I was buying chewing gum or beer, you could work that out. Would it
Yeah.
be helpful for me to get that alert and be told, listen, go and see your urologist straight away? Um, it would be, but on the other hand, there is a cost to that level of invasion. And do I want my
Yeah.
local supermarket being the one telling me that? And so we're starting to tackle those sorts of questions through regulation, and starting to say, um, look, you should only gather the data for which it is really, really what I've asked you to do. And we tend to point to Google as the sort of the bad guy in all of this, but
Mm.
which and there's no doubt some sort of excesses in its behavior. I think Facebook happens to do much more.
Mm.
Um, Apple does much less for a variety of reasons, but it's become so cheap and easy for companies to gather data that they do, even though it's useless. And so, I've been buying some corrugated plastic roofing for my for a little mini shed thing I'm putting up at the back of the garden.
Mm.
And the company in question, with whom I will do one transaction in my life,
Yeah.
has asked for my date of birth, right? And my a lot of data that they don't actually need.
Yeah.
They don't actually need my address. The logistics company needs my address. They don't. And there would be ways in which they that data could be, y- you know, transferred without my being involved. So, for
Yeah.
example, what the problem is that now there is some roofing company. I don't know if they've got a 300 grand a year chief information security officer who's running regular audits on their cyber risk or not. My prediction is they haven't. And so my prediction is that my data is stored in clear text somewhere on one of their databases waiting to be hacked and then used against me. So that in of itself is a problem. And so there are ways in which these sorts of things need to be tackled more, more broadly. And it's not just about the really, really big companies and what they know about us.
Yeah, and you mentioned that I personally feel quite powerless in relation to this next bit, but you've mentioned about collective action to
Mm.
kind of push back a little bit on these big companies who are using our data in ways that the average citizen just doesn't understand at all. Um, what is it you mean by collective action? I obviously know what collective action means, but just in this particular instance, in relation to our data.
Well, I think there's a few different things that can that we can do. One is i- around the expression of choice. The more that we use tools and that are made available to us, the more that is signaling to the companies that this is a product and a service that we need. I don't know how many people buy Apple products because of the privacy that they enable, um,
Mm.
but they should, right? If you care about that, and you should know that a lot of the data that you put on your Apple phone or in iCloud is not accessible to Apple. You should know that um, that your health data as well is garnered and grounded in ways that are very, very different to the way that your Google searches, your Amazon search history is dealt with, and so in a sense, coming up to speed with those types of things and using the tools that are available, like I regularly occasionally, I would say, will clear my Google Maps history when I'm idle and just sort of go off and clear it. And I'll clear
Yeah,
my, whatever history, from time to time. It's really expensive to do that as an individual to remember to do that. But part of the reason it's helpful is because these things remind the platforms that this is a consumer need, and they're always trying to serve that need in some way. But there are other types of collective action that become important. That includes how you engage in whatever expression or debate you have a platform for. I mean, I have a bigger platform than most people, so I can do more.
mm,
But in a sense, we ended up here because we slept walk through what were important debates, and ultimately, we're the ones who choose to watch Love Island rather than a YouTube video on privacy, right?
yeah,
And so at some point, politics reflects people's expressions of interest, and even though the science had run far ahead of climate change, it was only until people started to express it politically that it starts to that net zero shows up for better or worse on newspaper headlines. So
mm,
I think that we as listeners have an ability to express that shift. Um, and I'm not going to pretend that that any one voice changes what matters, but
mm,
many voices do change do change that. But then there's a third wrapping of all of this, which is that um, there is such a benefit in collective data. It's so your data individually is not that interesting.
mm,
It's data in aggregate that becomes really, really powerful, and there are so many benefits of it that we should be looking out for these collective approaches where they can help us. And a good example is the UK Biobank, which is run by Genomics England, amongst others. And what that's gone and done is it's got hundreds of thousands of gene sequences of people connected to their physical attributes, their height and their disease conditions and so on, their
Yeah.
phenotypic expression, as it's called. And what that's allowed us to do is understand what genes express what conditions and to what degree. And that is constructing a baseline for really, really improved medical interventions. And the thing about that is that that is not a database that is a kind of commercial database. It is almost a public good.
Yeah.
And there are many, many ways where we can kind of collectively start to contribute to things as public goods with our data. And what we have to do is we have to ask about whether the organization that is looking after that, whether they are actually acting in interests that we are aligned with. When we contribute our data to the Waze mapping system, or we contribute it to sort of Google's systems or Facebook systems, um, the exploitation of that is left up to those firms in ways that we might not necessarily agree with. And I think one thing that may change is that more of these data collectors will emerge over the coming years.